I've given a lot of thought and put a lot of effort into my DIY house rule document, so much so that it became easier to make it a full-blown self-contained rule set rather than merely a house rule document. However, I do also think that for some players, a completely homegrown DIY game may be more intimidating or off-putting than simply having a set of house rules to apply to something a bit more familiar. Some people really like to feel like they're playing an official game with rules that are readily available. I actually can add a pretty simple house rule template that would go on top of almost any other rule set. The only thing that would still need to vary is my custom races, but that's a little harder to make common in spite of system, so that's okay. So, if you're not using my regular rules document, then I think you could do well enough with any of the following systems, which I know well enough to confidently say that they'd work. Sword and Wizardry, any version. Labyrinth Lord, Basic Fantasy, Old School Essentials, or any of the original D&D rule sets that those are attempting to emulate, OD&D or BX. I actually think that the emulations or retro clones are better games at this point. Presumably they'd work just as well with something like Dark Dungeons X, which emulates the Beck Me or RC just as well, or any other retro clone that's not based on any AD&D version. It'd also work pretty well with Microlight Purist Essence or Microlight 74 or any of the other retro Microlights. Modern rules light games that have a bit of an OSR flair like Shadow Dark or Knave 2E or Five Torches Deep, maybe even better in some ways because they already have some of the modern improvements of my DIY game. I do also have other changes to the rules besides just for tone and mood. But what I want to talk about is how to implement some rules like a template on top of any of these rule sets, or even 5th edition or Pathfinder or Tales of the Valiant, etc., to GRIMDARK them up. If you do this, the other rules changes are more about personal preference. The suggestions below are specifically about genre, tone, and mood. First, your stats. Depending on which system you're modifying, you'll notice some differences with regards to the stat generation method you're presented with and what the stat bonuses are. In older games, the stat bonuses were more modest and only applied at the highest ability scores. In 3rd edition and above, they started applying much more smoothly across the wider range of ability scores, and the higher bonuses were much higher. That said, the math of ability scores and modifiers versus targets, like armor class, etc., remains more or less the same. As Professor Dungeon Master pointed out in a video a while ago, you need to roll an unmodified 8 or better on your D20. All of the changes to modifiers, bonuses, and target numbers don't change this. The bigger numbers are, however, psychologically designed to make you feel more powerful, even if mathematically you actually aren't any different. For a more grimdark game, go back to old school bonuses. The addition of a couple of extra points of bonus won't make enough of a difference to make the game unplayable, but it will change the psychology of the players, as they recognize that their characters don't have the inflated bonuses that they're used to, and they'll feel the difference. A few near misses that would have hit with an extra +1 or +2, and they'll really feel it. But it shouldn't actually change their overall ability to succeed from a macro view. Next, hit points. If this concept applies psychologically to stats, it applies even more to hit points. In most modern games, it's actually gotten quite difficult to kill PCs once they get past a certain level. However, in my opinion, the very low hit points of older games at low level is too low to actually facilitate a grimdark mood. Sure. There were some famous meat grinder games back in the day, but that doesn't actually encourage a darker tone. Rather, it becomes a game of either frustration or of dark comedy as you flame out with your fighter Conan, followed by Fronin and Ronin and Zonin, etc. I think modern D&D did smart in giving the lowest level PCs more hit points. enough to take at least a hit or two in all but the most unlucky of cases. However, it quickly grows out of control as you add levels. I don't add hit dice anymore in my game. I add 2 hit points when you level up. That's it. Characters need to be vulnerable. And the genre changes considerably as you level up in regular D&D to one of overt superheroes who don't seriously fear almost anything that could happen to them in combat. Players routinely and blithely jump into fights, shouting huzzah and expecting to win D&D, because their characters have been designed by the game designers to win D&D. The single most important thing to do to change the game to a more grimdark tone and feel is to keep hit points lower. Levels in D&D also can work against a grimdark tone unless managed carefully. In my experience, even without runaway hit points, there's little reason to play the game at very high levels. Wizards of the Coast have previously shared research of even regular D&D games, and they discovered that an extremely small percentage of gamers ever get up above about 7th level or so. I recommend greatly slowing leveling down. If characters are leveling up every other session or so, and in my experience that's not unheard of at all, I strongly suggest cutting that down to only 20 to 25% or so that speed. I wouldn't even mind 10%, but maybe that's too radical to accept without first weaning yourselves off of the level up dopamine hits. Death and dying rules are also an obvious target for change. In older games, PCs were dead when they hit or fell below 0 hit points. In 3rd edition and newer games, there has been some kind of a dying status where you were out of the fight and dying, but not dead per se, unless you were at either -10 hit points or failed 3 death saves with an easy DC, etc. I actually don't have a problem with the concept of giving the PCs a chance to not die. Too much death of player characters starts to turn the game into an absurd parody rather than a grimdark feel. But it's also true that most modern games have been too generous in terms of allowing get-out-of-death free cards. I now allow 1 death save DC 15. If you fail it, you die instantly. If you pass it, you still die in 2 rounds unless you are stabilized. If you still have a heroism token handy, my equivalent to the old action point concept, you can convert death into a near-death experience by spending it. You'll instantly go to 0 hit points, you'll be unconscious but stable, and will take a permanent scar, i.e., a permanent loss of a stat bonus. This is psychologically the right approach for me. It feels like death, but the near-miss mechanic means death isn't quite as permanent as it could be. Sanity is another optional add-on. This is a mechanic made famous by the venerable Call of Cthulhu role-playing game written by Sandy Peterson. It was stuck in the D20 Call of Cthulhu game without any attempt to convert it to a native D20 feel. A few years later, it was ported to Unearthed Arcana, made open content, and officially became an option for D&D 3.5. Many fantasy games flirting with horror themes and tone have attempted to either use a variation of this sanity mechanic or create one of their own that feels more native to its system. I find that the original Call of Cthulhu sanity rules are pretty fiddly and too complicated. It feels like the author who created it couldn't resist showing off the research he did on actual mental disorders, when in reality, a much more simple system that was easier and quicker to apply at the table would have served better. The concept of sanity as it works in these systems is maybe questionable, but it's a well-recognized genre convention. And while probably not at all realistic, neither are a lot of other things that routinely happen in the hobby to characters. I also have a sanity mechanic in my DIY game, but it mostly only comes into play when attempting to cast spells. The whole Fail a sanity check when you see some tentacles or whatever is borderline silly, but the idea that trying to use magic strains or even breaks your brain works very well for me and the grimdark tone that I want. My sanity mechanics are incredibly simple. You make what is essentially a charisma saving throw. Charisma plus level, and if you fail, you consult a little D6 table and apply the temporary effect. If you critically fail it, natural one, you pick up a permanent penalty to your sanity checks in the future. Magic in D&D also isn't very grimdark. It's too predictable and utilitarian. I greatly prefer roll to cast over spell slots and spells per day. Difficulty class is 10 plus 2 times the spell level. In other words, a second level spell would be DC 14, a fourth level spell would be DC 18, etc. You can cast them as often as you want. If you fail, you make a sanity check. The DC is the same as the spell check level, and the spell fails to do anything. If you critically fail your spellcraft roll, your spell backfires and targets you. If that doesn't actually make sense for the given spell, then instead an otherworldly entity is ripped from the outer darkness from whence magic comes and attacks you obsessively until either you or it is killed. Area effect spells can be really nasty because they might well end up targeting your entire group. In addition, on a critical fail, you make your sanity check with disadvantage. Critical failure, which because it happens on a natural one will happen on average once every 20 times you attempt to cast, is a little bit like Russian roulette. Sure, you can cast as much as you like as long as your roll to cast is successful. But even a regular failed roll is a risk. A chance at a failed sanity check and a failed spell. But a critical failure? Ouch. This makes magic much less routine and mechanistic, as it tends to be for D&D and other similar games, and more mysterious and edgy and potentially kind of frightening. Magic items have become another anti-grimdark convenience in modern D&D. This one is pretty simple to address. Magic items are much more rare than is normal in any edition of the official game, even the older ones. Not only that, if you have a magic item, it's probably a mixed blessing at best. Maybe it does what you need it to do, i.e., it works against ghosts or demons or whatever, while a normal item would not, but it also has a cost associated with it. I once created a magical super-sized sword that was too big for the characters to really use effectively. It had a mouth on the hilt that actually bit the hand of the user and drained his life slowly, and whispered vile thoughts that slowly drove the user crazy. But it was the only way to defeat a particularly nasty undead creature that otherwise was likely to kill the entire party. Like spells, all magic in the game, including magic items, is a two-edged sword as dangerous to the user as to the target. Finally, the use of monsters in D&D needs to be addressed. This isn't any kind of mechanical thing to do, though, just a question of style. Monsters should never be routine. Encounters with them shouldn't be random, and they shouldn't be a regular part of your morning commute on the way to the adventure. Fighting monsters shouldn't ever be easy or boring or whatever. Even low-level monsters like goblins or kobolds deserve to be frightening and to use tactics or strategies that make them dangerous. They should be foreshadowed, and they should be played up to be scary and disconcerting, if not outright creepy. There should always be a question as to whether or not the PCs are even capable of defeating the monsters in a straight-up fight, and PCs should avoid as much as possible getting sucked into that situation. They need to research, plan, and strategize how to minimize the monster's advantages and work a little harder. The idea that you just shout, "Come at me, bro!" Roll initiative and charge into combat with the expectation that you're prepared to win at D&D is the antithesis of the grimdark tone and should always be avoided. What do you do to make sure that your game has enough action and combat then? Bad guys, criminals, thugs, cultists, bandits, etc. Wild animals are another good alternative. Now granted, I'm not at all saying that you shouldn't have the PCs fight monsters. In every episode of The X-Files, there was some kind of investigation and confrontation with a monster, alien, or other creepy type of something or other. You need to do the same. But they should never be routine, and you keep the game action packed with more mundane threats while building up tension and foreshadowing for your monsters at all times. That's the grimdark mood and tone.